So you take all these trends together. Here's the core question I want you to consider. Is my church a destination or a vehicle? For 30 years, we've been told that the way to do ministry is to make the church a destination. Fill your church with very attractive features, dynamic preaching, phenomenal music, lots of programs, entertain the kids, make sure the dads love being there, engage felt needs, and then when people do come, equip them and train them to engage the institution, to give their money to the institution, to serve the institution, to volunteer in the institution, ultimately to grow the institution even bigger. That's the model we've inherited for the last 30 years. But for a generation that thinks institutions are inherently dangerous and that's entrepreneurial in its faith, this model is eroding. Or is your church a vehicle? Does it see beyond itself? Does it have a goal beyond the growth of its own institutional footprint? Now, when I say these things to groups of church leaders or when I show a slide like this, invariably when I interact with folks, I'm just going to cut you off before you talk to me later. What they say, our church is not inwardly focused. We're not institutional because our mission is about, engaging the world or glorifying God or making disciples or impacting the community. We're missional. Let me tell you something. Every church thinks it's missional. Every church thinks it's missional. A couple years ago, I got in trouble because we were trying to do an article, Leadership Journal, and we wanted to interview a missional church leader and an attractional church leader. Get them in the room together and interview them and kind of figure out the differences in these models. I called up one pastor after another who I thought really exemplified the attractional church model. And I would talk to them on the phone to see if they're interested in doing this interview, and then they'd get upset with me when they find out I was contacting them about the attractional role rather than the missional role, because they all think they're missional. I don't even know what the word missional means anymore. It's so overused. So let's just drop the term. The reality is that most churches in North America, I don't care how big or small your church is, most churches in North America have a mission and then they have a shadow mission. The mission is whatever you've plastered on your website or in your wall in the office or whatever's at the top of your stationery. That's your mission. The shadow mission of most churches in North America is ultimately to perpetuate and grow the institution. It's the ABCs of ministry: attendance, buildings, and cash. As long as those things are increasing, we're happy. The problem is that model of church, the cruise ship model, the church as destination model, is eroding. The younger generation isn't buying it like they used to. And if you're in a part of the country where they still are, you're in luck because you have time to adapt. I ask these students, tell me about your communion with Christ. And they look at me kind of weird, like, what do you mean? I said, and I don't modify the question, tell me about your communion with Christ. And they'll say things like, well, I read my Bible regularly, or sometimes I try to pray for stuff that I need. But I said, well, tell me when's the last time you encountered him in your life? And most of them can't answer the question. They talk about God as if they're working in a corporation the way you would talk about the CEO. I serve him, appreciate what he does, but he's pretty much just a picture on the wall. I don't actually know the guy. Here's the irony. In so many of our churches, we talk about a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, but we never actually equip people to have one. We give them a vision for the church. We give them a vision for ministry. We give them a vision for evangelism. We give them a vision for outreach. We give them a vision for church growth, but we don't actually give them a ravishing vision of Jesus Christ himself. And young people aren't tolerating it. That is the primary reason they are walking out of the church. Ironically, it's because they're looking for God, and what we're giving them instead is the church. We are supposed to desire Christ, but the American church has reduced him to a device. As a friend of mine likes to say, in the American church, we've made Jesus Christ into the duct tape WD-40 combo pack. He's all you need to fix just about anything. I want a better marriage. I want a better job. I want to get over this problem. I want to get over that problem. And we tell people Jesus is how you do it. We make him into a device that we use to achieve some other goal rather than make Jesus the goal himself. And then we take a device, the church, which is designed to bring us into communion with Christ, and instead we make the church the goal. Make the church the desire. Make the church the destination. And for a generation that's hungry, desperately looking for communion with God, and anti-institutional, the church is going to not meet that need. The very first thing we have to get clear if we're going to be effective going forward is that the goal is God, not the church. You know, it's interesting that at the same time that the church model shifted from church as vehicle to church as destination, our vocabulary changed. We invented a new word to define our new goal. We no longer seek to reach the lost or the non-believer. We seek to reach the unchurched. Because implied in that word is the goal. Connect them to the church. John Piper, interesting dude. Be honest with you, I don't always agree with John Piper, but even a broken watch is right twice a day. I'm kidding. John wrote one of the most phenomenal books of the 20th century. He has a quote that has just seared into my mind. He says, "The goal of the gospel is not to get people to heaven. The gospel is how people get to God. And if you would be happy in heaven if Jesus were not there, you will not be there." Where is your church taking people? Is it taking them to Jesus? Is it teaching them how to commune intimately with Him, even without all the trappings of the church? Is it creating in them the ability to commune with Jesus in a self-perpetuating way through the presence of the Holy Spirit? And if you come to my session this afternoon, pastors, I'll talk to you more about what that looks like. But that's what this generation is asking for. And ironically, it's what the church over the last 30 years has become less and less equipped to do for them. Sally Morgenthaler, who's an expert in worship, said, "We are not producing worshipers in this country. Rather, we are producing a generation of spectators, religious onlookers lacking, in many cases, any memory of a true encounter with God, deprived of both the tangible sense of God's presence and the supernatural relationship that their inmost spirits crave." This is exactly what I'm seeing in the college students I've worked with over the last 5 years. They've been doing church all their life, but they've not met Jesus. We are inoculating a generation to the gospel, and we're doing it really, really effectively. As Dallas Willard likes to say, our systems are perfectly designed to produce the results we are experiencing. It's not an anomaly that a generation is walking away from God. It is what we have designed our churches to do. And I know that sounds harsh, but we have to start asking hard questions about what we assume the church's purpose is. And this is a chart that should scare you. Average age of first marriages in the U.S. between 1960 and 2010. A generation ago, people got married when they were 22, 23, and 20. Those lines are men and women, blue and green. Now it's inching closer to 30, and that's a few years ago, so we may have crossed that line for men. Why should this scare you? Sociologists a number of years ago, looking at the church, coined a term. They call it the marriage or the driver's license to marriage license hiatus. Anyone heard that before? The driver's license to marriage license hiatus. What it signifies is the idea that a lot of people tend to drop out of church around the time they get their driver's license, 16, 18 years old, graduating high school, right around that time frame. And they tend to stay away from the church until they get married and until they have a family. And then with the pressures and needs of a family and everything, they kind of feel this tug back into the church. Now, a generation ago, that driver's license to marriage license hiatus may have been 3, 4, 5, 6 years, and then people would come back. And they came back pretty consistently. But over the last couple of years, that's not true anymore. What we're finding is that young people still leave the church around the time they get their driver's license or they go to college, but now fewer and fewer are coming back. Why? Well, because they're getting married later and later. And if you've spent a decade and a half outside of the church, you disassociate your identity from the church. So here's the thing. Most of us are probably in churches that have designed their ministries around the assumption of a nuclear family. Children's ministries, nurseries, age-based ministries, youth ministries, and then we have marriage ministries and men's ministries and women's ministries that are primarily focused on helping people in one of the most relevant parts of their life, which is their family, and that's appropriate and that's good. What happens if you're 26 years old and you're searching for God but you don't have a family because you're not married and you don't have kids? Or what happens if you're one of the women in this country who are now single moms? You know that last year, for the first time, more than 50% of children born in the United States were born to single mothers? In the black community, it's 74%. If your church is designed to reach mom, dad, and kids, your church is going to have a very small mission field in the coming years. So what do you do with this generation of young people, 35 and under, who don't have their identity primarily rooted in a spouse and in children? Where do they get their identity? They get it from their job.